Have you ever sat on the edge of your seat waiting for the end of the world? On New Year's Eve in 1999, millions of people braced for the Y2K chaos. Some pulled their money from banks, others huddled around candles, and a few truly expected planes to fall from the sky. But when the clock struck midnight, nothing happened. A dozen years later, news channels counted down to December 21st, 2012, the supposed end of the Mayan calendar. Yet, the next morning, the sun rose as usual. Why do we keep falling for the same old prophetic claims? From the pages of Abrahamic scriptures to contemporary cults, from ancient India to modern internet panics, you will see a surprising pattern that repeats across time and culture. Along the way, you will hear about a preacher whose prediction emptied bank accounts, a medieval Indian text that predicted British colonialism, and a doomsday cult whose members calmly drank poison because of a comet. Stick around, because near the end, we will reveal the most creative reinterpretation of a failed prophecy you have ever heard. The New Testament is full of statements about the end times. For many of Jesus' earliest followers, this was not a distant event. They expected it in their own lifetimes. Jesus himself told his disciples, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened." Taken literally, that promise means some people standing in front of him would live to see those events. 2000 years later, the world continues to spin on its axis, and those first century listeners are long gone. The Apostle Paul shared this imminent expectation. Writing to the Thessalonians, he included himself among those who would still be alive when Jesus returned. In another letter, he declared, "We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed," using sleep as a euphemism for death. Paul wasn't talking about centuries. He believed the final trumpet would sound within his lifetime. Yet, Paul died. The Thessalonian church died, but the end never arrived. Modern apologists often argue that Jesus and Paul were speaking figuratively about a far future generation or a spiritual transformation. The failure of these prophecies doesn't automatically disprove Christianity, but it does show that even saints can be wrong about the timetable of divine plans. Fast forward to the 1840s and you meet William Miller, a Baptist farmer from upstate New York who pored over the book of Daniel and concluded that Christ would return in 1843. When his first window closed, Miller settled on 22nd October 1844. Tens of thousands of followers known as Millerites sold farms, left jobs, and waited on hilltops to see Jesus. One devotee wrote that he spent the entire day looking towards the sky, but as darkness fell and nothing happened, his hope died and he felt sick at heart. Miller publicly admitted his error, yet some followers could not accept defeat. They claimed a hidden heavenly event occurred that day and that the prophecy had been fulfilled invisibly. This reinterpretation gave birth to what eventually became the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Just a few decades later, a new movement repeated the pattern: Jehovah's Witness. Early publications of Watchtower Society declared that Christ's kingdom would fully be established in 1914 and the times of the Gentiles would end in October that year. Followers were urged to leave their jobs and prepare to be taken to heaven. When October 1914 came and went with no Armageddon, the organization pivoted. 1914 was no longer the end of worldly governments, but the start of Christ's invisible heavenly reign. Over the next decades, leaders suggested new dates: 1918, 1925, and famously 1975. Leading up to 1975, members sold homes, quit careers, and adopted the slogan, "Stay alive till 75," only for the year to pass uneventfully. In each case, the leadership blamed overzealous members for misreading subtle hints or claimed that God's plans were spiritual rather than visible. Islamic texts also contain doomsday predictions, and some appear to give startlingly short timelines. In one widely cited hadith, Muhammad pointed to a young boy and told his companions that the last hour would arrive before that boy grew old. That boy lived a full life and died centuries ago, but the day of judgment did not arrive. Later scholars explain that the last hour here referred to the companion's death rather than the end of the world. By changing the meaning of the word hour, the prophecy could be saved without accusing the prophet of error. Another narration in Sunan Abu Dawud predicted that three events, the greatest war, the conquest of Constantinople, and the appearance of the Dajjal or the Antichrist, would occur within 7 months of each other. Constantinople indeed fell to the Ottomans in 1453, many years later, yet no Dajjal appeared within months or centuries. Believers have largely spiritualized or deferred the prophecy. Some still argue that Dajjal lies ahead in an yet to be determined future. Even the Quran hints at historical events that seemed urgent. In Surah Ar-Rum, it states that the Romans, who had been defeated by the Persians, would soon win again within a few years. Historically, the Byzantine comeback took more than a decade. Commentators stretched the definition of a few years to fit the verse. As with Christian texts, the common theme is that when events fail to unfold as expected, the interpretation shifts from literal to metaphorical. Hinduism typically envisions the cosmos in vast cycles, making doomsday predictions less common than in Abrahamic faiths. However, some texts are touted as prophetic. The Bhavishya Purana, whose name means the future Purana, contains passages that appear to describe historical figures like Nadir Shah, Queen Victoria, and even the British Parliament. Yet, scholars have discovered that these sections were likely inserted centuries after the events actually occurred. Some passages mention a teacher called Mahamada instructing foreign lands, and certain apologists claim that this predicts Muhammad. Before any Muslim believer jumps up and down thinking that even Hindu texts have mentioned about Muhammad, then let me tell you that the surrounding verses portray him as a polluter of righteousness and an incarnation of a demon. Because these texts can be updated, they avoid clear falsification. Any prophecy that does not come true can be revised or interpreted symbolically. Other predictions, such as the arrival of the Kalki avatar at the end of the current age, are placed tens of thousands of years in the future, well beyond the ability of any skeptic to test. If you think failed prophecies are a relic of the past, think again. In the 20th and 21st centuries, doomsday predictions have gone viral at an unprecedented scale, sometimes with tragic results. At the turn of the millennium, fears about a computer coding glitch led to apocalyptic speculation. Some religious leaders suggested God might use the Y2K chaos to usher in the end times. Families stocked up on food and withdrew cash. News segments showed panic shoppers and preachers warning of global collapse. In the end, thanks to software fixes and perhaps because the fears were overstated, only minor glitches occurred. The event illustrates how easily a technical problem can morph into a prophetic narrative. Few modern panics rival the hype around December 21st, 2012. A misrepresentation of the Mayan long count calendar convinced millions that the world would end on that date. Films, books, and YouTube videos predicted asteroid impacts, polar shifts, and a mystical shift in consciousness. Meanwhile, archaeologists and NASA scientists repeatedly explained that the Mayan calendar simply resets to a new cycle, like flipping a page on a calendar. and that there was no scientific evidence for disaster. Nonetheless, some believers gathered at pyramids and sacred sites while others waited for a spiritual awakening. When 22nd December dawned and nothing spectacular happened, most quietly moved on. The list goes on. In 1910, some feared that gases from Halley's comet would poison the atmosphere, prompting sales of comet pills. In 1997, members of the Heaven's Gate cult believed a spaceship trailing comet Halley would take them to salvation. They committed mass suicide. Televangelist Pat Robertson predicted the end in 1982. Radio preacher Harold Camping announced Judgment Day for May 21, 2011, then postponed it to October when nothing happened. Each time, the pattern repeats. A charismatic figure claims inside knowledge. Followers invest emotionally and materially. The date passes and a story is spun to explain the failure. At this point, you might be wondering, if prophecy after prophecy fails, why do people keep buying in? Psychologists have an answer. In the 1950s, sociologist Leon Festinger infiltrated a UFO cult whose members believed a flood would destroy the world. When the predicted date passed on without disaster, the core believers didn't abandon their faith. They doubled down, claiming their prayers had spared humanity. Festinger then coined the term cognitive dissonance to describe the mental discomfort people feel when evidence contradicts deeply held beliefs. To reduce that discomfort, they often reinterpret the evidence rather than abandon the belief. The coping mechanism is everywhere in our story. So what should we make of this long history of failed prophecies? On the positive side, it highlights the human capacity for storytelling. Prophecies offer hope for justice, comfort in suffering, and the thrill of living in extraordinary times. But the track record is undeniable. Across millennia and cultures, no detailed, time-bound prophecy has ever come true in the way its believers expected. If a prophecy truly came from an all-knowing deity, we will not expect a 100% failure rate. The lesson here is more modest. Be wary of anyone, whether a pastor, imam, pandit, or influencer, who claims to know exactly what will happen and when. History shows that they are almost always wrong. Instead of surrendering your life to doomsday dates, focus on living well, culturing empathy, and nurturing curiosity. So the next time a charismatic figure whispers, "The end is near," pause and ask, what makes this prophecy different from all the others that failed? Remember the great disappointment, the missed Armageddons, the Y2K scare, and the quiet sunrise on 22nd December 2012. Thanks for watching, and think twice before buying that bunker. And you shall see me in the next video unless the world ends before that.